What if the oldest written records we possess aren't the beginning of civilization's story, but the middle? What if they're not describing the dawn of knowledge, but remembering its twilight, fragments of something that came before, preserved by people who knew they were recording the end of one world and the seed of another, in the hushed archives of museums across the world, pressed into clay tablets that predate the pyramids? The earliest Sumerian scribes left accounts that modern historians have learned to read but struggle to reconcile with everything we think we know about human history. These aren't primitive origin myths written by people learning to count and build. They're precise records describing kings who ruled for thousands of years, cities that existed before the flood, knowledge of cosmic cycles that shouldn't have been possible to calculate, and technologies whose purposes we still debate. When Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs of Ur in the 1920s, he found more than golden treasures and ancient graves. He found evidence of a break, a discontinuity, a layer of water-laid clay separating two completely different civilizations. Below that flood line, the artifacts changed. The pottery was different, the architecture more refined, as if something had been lost and then slowly, painfully rebuilt. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and memory. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient mystery stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. In 1896, when German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht first published fragments of what would become known as the Sumerian King List, he unknowingly opened a controversy that still echoes through archaeology departments today. The tablets, baked hard by ancient fires and buried for millennia, contained something that shouldn't exist according to the accepted timeline of human civilization. They listed kings, dynasties, and reigns extending back before any flood, before any city we'd found evidence for, describing rulers who governed for periods that defied human lifespan and a world that mainstream history had no room to accommodate. Imagine holding one of those tablets yourself. The clay is warm in your hands, fired so hard it survived 4,000 years buried in Iraqi soil. Your fingers trace the wedge-shaped impressions, each mark pressed deliberately into wet clay by a scribe who died before Rome existed, before Greece existed, before anyone had conceived of writing history the way we understand it. The cuneiform signs march across the surface in neat columns, and if you could read them, they would tell you something impossible. They would list kings who ruled not for decades, but for millennia. Cities that predated any settlement, archaeology had confirmed. A world that drowned beneath waters that swept everything away. Hilprecht wasn't working alone. The tablet fragments he published had been excavated from Nippur, that ancient city of scribes and scholars, by expedition teams from the University of Pennsylvania. They arrived back in museum collections as broken pieces, puzzles that needed reassembling, texts that needed translating. Other versions of the King List emerged from different sites: Lhasa, Ur, Uruk. Each copy varied slightly in detail but agreed on the essential structure. Before the flood there were kings. After the flood, civilization began again, but diminished somehow, with rulers whose lives spanned normal human decades rather than impossible ages. The academic world didn't know what to do with this information. How do you incorporate 28,000-year reigns into a historical timeline? How do you reconcile cities existing before the flood with the absence of archaeological evidence for anything that old? The simplest solution was to dismiss the antediluvian section as purely mythological, a creation story, theological rather than historical. Scholars focused instead on the post-flood kings, whose reign seemed plausible and whose cities could be excavated and confirmed. The early section was filed away under mythology and left there, an embarrassing remnant of primitive thinking that cluttered otherwise useful historical records. But the tablets themselves resisted that dismissal. They were too precise, too matter-of-fact in their presentation. This wasn't the language of myth. There were no divine interventions, no magical transformations, no cosmic battles. Just names, places, lengths of rule, and the simple notation of when kingship transferred from one city to another. The style was administrative, bureaucratic, the same tone used for recording grain shipments and temple inventories. And that single line, "Then the flood swept over," sat there like a geological boundary, dividing time itself into before and after with the casual certainty of someone recording observable fact. What made Hilprecht's publication truly significant wasn't just the content but the timing. 1896 sat at the dawn of a new era in archaeology and ancient Near Eastern studies. Scholars were just beginning to crack the code of cuneiform writing systems, just starting to excavate Mesopotamian sites systematically, just realizing how deep human history extended beyond the biblical timeline that had dominated Western thought. The Sumerian king list arrived into that intellectual ferment like a hand grenade. It suggested civilization was older than anyone imagined, that catastrophic floods had actually occurred, that the biblical narrative might be rooted in real historical events, and most disturbingly, that there might have been something before what we considered the beginning. The king list divides itself into two distinct periods, separated by a single, devastating line. Then the flood swept over. Before that cataclysm, it records 8 kings ruling 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. Not generations, not dynasties. Individual kings with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar, who followed him, held power for 36,000 years. Modern scholars call these numbers symbolic, mythological, impossible. But what if they're none of those things? What if they're records kept in a different system, measuring something we no longer understand? Consider how the text presents these figures. There's no fanfare, no explanation, no sense that the scribes thought these numbers strange or requiring justification. They simply recorded them with the same straightforward precision they used for everything else. Alulim ruled from Eridu for 28,800 years. Then Alalgar took kingship and ruled for 36,000 years. Then Bad Tibira received kingship, and Enmeluana ruled for 43,200 years. The pattern continues through 8 antediluvian rulers across 5 cities, each reign listed with mathematical precision, each transfer of power noted as if it were recent political history rather than mythological prehistory. What makes these numbers even more intriguing is their inconsistency. They aren't round figures. They aren't neat multiples suggesting symbolic meaning. 28,800 is a strange number to invent for mythological purposes. 43,200 is oddly specific. If these were purely symbolic, you'd expect cleaner mathematics, rounder figures, numbers that clearly meant something beyond their face value. Instead, you get what looks like actual recorded data. Figures someone wrote down because that's what the record said, not because they represented cosmic truths or theological principles. Some scholars have suggested these might be measurements in a different unit. Perhaps they're counting lunar months rather than solar years, which would reduce Alulim's reign to approximately 2,400 years. Still impossibly long for an individual human, but at least approaching the realm of dynastic periods or cultural epochs. Others propose the numbers represent something else entirely: astronomical cycles, generations counted differently, or perhaps they're using a base 60 sexagesimal system in ways we haven't fully understood. The Sumerians loved base 60. They built their entire mathematical system around it. Could these vast numbers be calculations in that system, measurements of time or cosmic cycles that we're misinterpreting as individual lifespans? But there's another possibility that scholarship tends to avoid because it leads down uncomfortable paths. What if the numbers are essentially accurate, recording actual periods of time, but they're not measuring the reigns of individual humans at all? What if Alulim wasn't a person but a dynasty, a cultural period, an age? What if kingship itself meant something different before the flood, something we've lost the context to understand? Ancient Mesopotamians thought in terms of cosmic cycles, ages of the world, periods when different forces held sway. Could the antediluvian kings be personifications of these ages, symbols representing vast stretches of time when particular cities held cultural or spiritual primacy? The text itself offers a clue in how it treats these figures. After the flood, when kingship begins again, the reigns are still long by our standards, but far more human in scale. The first dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings with reigns ranging from around 40 to 1,200 years. These numbers decline further in later dynasties until they reach what seem like plausible human lifespans. It's as if the record is watching time speed up, or measurement systems change, or perhaps accurately documenting how whatever allowed those early long reigns gradually faded until humans lived normal spans again. Beneath the ruins of southern Iraq, where the Euphrates once flowed through marshlands that are now desert, archaeologists have traced the remains of Eridu back through layer after layer of settlement. The Sumerians themselves claimed it as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. When excavations began in the 1940s, they expected to find perhaps 5 or 6 building levels. Instead, they uncovered 19 successive temples built one atop another, each more sophisticated than reason suggested, each older than seemed possible, descending through millennia until they reached flood-disturbed soil, and then, below that, something older still. The excavation of Eridu stands as one of archaeology's most humbling moments. When Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd led the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities team into those ruins in 1946, they anticipated a straightforward dig. They'd excavate a Sumerian temple, document its architecture, collect artifacts and move on. Instead, they found themselves digging deeper and deeper through time, peeling back layer after layer of construction that spoke to a continuity of sacred use spanning thousands of years. Each temple had been carefully buried and a new one built directly above it, maintaining the sanctity of the location while updating the structure. 19 times this happened. 19 iterations of the same sacred space, each one adding to the accumulated holiness of the site. What struck the excavators most was the quality of the architecture. They expected primitive early structures gradually giving way to more sophisticated later temples. Instead, they found competence throughout, sophisticated mud brick architecture at every level, as if the builders always knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest temples showed understanding of load-bearing walls, drainage systems, and architectural proportion. By the time they reached the bottom levels, they were looking at construction from around 5500 BCE, far older than Sumerian civilization was supposed to be, built by people whose identity remained mysterious. And then came the flood layer. Not just one, but multiple levels of water-laid sediment interrupting the sequence of temples. The clay was different from the building material around it, sterile and deposited by water, marking periods when the site had been abandoned or inundated. Yet after each flood evidence, construction resumed, often with slightly different techniques, as if new peoples had arrived or survivors had returned with altered knowledge. The deepest levels, below the lowest flood deposits, revealed pottery and artifacts that didn't match the later Sumerian material. They were different in style, technique, and aesthetic sensibility, as if belonging to another culture entirely. The implications troubled everyone involved. If Eridu had this much occupational history, if people had been building sophisticated temples there since at least 5500 BCE, and possibly earlier, then the Sumerian civilization wasn't a sudden development around 3200 BCE as textbooks claimed. It was the culmination of thousands of years of occupation, the latest chapter in a much longer story. And those earlier chapters, the ones below the flood layers, belonged to peoples we couldn't name, cultures we hadn't identified, civilizations that mainstream archaeology had no framework to accommodate. The temple sequence also validated something the King List claimed, that Eridu was first. Whatever else might be questioned about these ancient texts, they got this right. Eridu was where it began, where people first built sacred spaces, where some form of organized urban or proto-urban life took root in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians didn't invent this claim for political purposes. They were remembering an actual truth about their past, preserving knowledge that archaeological excavation would eventually confirm. If they were right about Eridu being first, what else might they have been right about? When Leonard Woolley's team dug deep into the Royal Cemetery at in 1929, they broke through ancient graves, through pottery sherds and broken walls, through the accumulated debris of centuries, until their spades hit something that stopped them cold. A layer of water-laid clay, absolutely sterile, 8 feet thick in some places, stretched across the excavation without a single artifact, without a trace of human presence. It was the kind of deposit left only by massive flooding, the kind that drowns landscapes and buries cities. And below it, on the other side of that geological silence, they found different pottery, different architecture, as if the civilization that came after the flood had to relearn everything the hard way. Woolley knew immediately what he'd found, or rather he thought he knew. In the excitement of discovery, he announced to the press that he'd found evidence of Noah's flood, the biblical deluge, proof that the story was rooted in historical fact. The newspapers loved it. The public loved it. Here was archaeology validating scripture, science confirming faith, the modern world's machinery of excavation and analysis bringing ancient truth to light. But the reality, as it emerged through more careful analysis, was both more complex and more interesting than a simple confirmation of biblical narrative. The flood deposit at was real. 8 feet of sterile clay doesn't lie. Water had inundated this region, depositing sediment, burying everything beneath it, and then receding to allow reoccupation. But when other sites in southern Mesopotamia were examined, flood layers appeared at different levels, different dates, sometimes multiple times. There wasn't one great flood. There were many floods, periodic inundations that struck different cities at different times across centuries or millennia. The region was prone to catastrophic flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates could overflow their banks with devastating force. Seasonal floods, storm surges from the Persian Gulf, breached levees, and failed water management could all produce localized disasters that would seem like the end of the world to those experiencing them. Yet something about the flood layer was different. Its thickness, its extent across the excavation area, the complete absence of any contamination from human occupation, and most tellingly what lay below it, suggested this particular flood was worse than most. Below that clay barrier, Woolley's team found a different cultural assemblage. The pottery was painted in styles that didn't match later Sumerian ware. The architecture used different building techniques. Even the way people buried their dead had changed. It was as if the flood marked a genuine break in cultural continuity, a moment when one way of life ended and another different one began. The dates were problematic. Radiocarbon dating wouldn't be developed for another decade, so Woolley's team relied on pottery typology and architectural analysis to estimate age. They placed the flood somewhere around 3500 to 4000 BCE, which was old but not impossibly ancient. Yet even that relatively recent date created difficulties. If a catastrophic flood had struck around 3500 BCE, destroying an established culture and forcing survivors to rebuild, then there had indeed been a pre-flood civilization in Mesopotamia, one whose achievements were lost and had to be painstakingly reconstructed. The Sumerian king list wasn't just mythology. It was preserving genuine historical memory, however distorted, of a world before the waters came. What fascinated subsequent archaeologists was the pattern Woolley identified. The culture below the flood layer wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, producing fine pottery, constructing permanent buildings, engaging in trade networks that brought materials from distant regions. These weren't simple farmers barely scraping by. They were people who'd achieved a level of civilization, who had culture, craft specialization, and social organization. And then the flood swept over, burying it all beneath 8 feet of water-laid clay, and when people returned they had to start again, building on top of the destruction, carrying forward whatever knowledge they'd managed to preserve but clearly having lost something in the catastrophe. The records that survived describe the antediluvian world with a specificity that seems strange for myth. They list cities by name: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. They name the kings and their fathers. They record the transfer of kingship from city to city, as if describing historical events, political changes, the rise and fall of urban centres. And scattered through later texts, in epic poems and temple inscriptions, glimpses emerge of what that world contained: vast knowledge of the heavens, understanding of mathematics and engineering, cosmic wisdom that was somehow lost when the flood swept everything away and had to be painstakingly rediscovered by those who came after. This precision troubles the mythological interpretation. Myths typically deal in archetypes and symbols. They're not concerned with specific geography or political succession. Yet the king list reads like administrative history. It tells you not just that there were antediluvian kings, but exactly which cities they ruled from, in what sequence, and for how long. It names Bad Tibira as the second city to hold kingship, specifying that 3 kings ruled there for a combined 108,000 years before kingship transferred to Larak. It places Sippar in the sequence before the final antediluvian city of Shurupak. These are specific geographical claims that can be investigated, sites that archaeology can attempt to locate and excavate. And remarkably, when archaeologists did go looking, they found these places. Shurupak was excavated at Tel Farah, and revealed to be a real city with a real flood layer. Sippar's ruins were identified at Tel Abu Haba in the late 1800s. Bad Tibira has been tentatively identified with the site of Tel al-Madain, though excavation has been limited. These weren't invented locations, they were actual urban centres that existed in the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. The king list wasn't fantasizing, it was recording real places, preserving the names and sequence of cities that held importance in the deep past. What's more intriguing are the references scattered through other texts that fill in details about this antediluvian world. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions that Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, preserved tablets of knowledge from before the deluge. Temple inscriptions refer to kings from before the flood as sources of ancient wisdom. Mathematical and astronomical texts sometimes claim their knowledge derives from antediluvian times, suggesting there was a body of learning that predated Sumerian civilization proper and was passed down through the catastrophe. These aren't casual references. They're specific claims that the knowledge Mesopotamian scribes used and valued had roots extending back before the flood disrupted everything. Consider what that implies about cultural memory and the preservation of information. If the flood occurred around 3500 BCE and Sumerian civilization proper emerged around 3200 BCE, that's only 300 years for survivors to preserve, transmit, and eventually re-establish the knowledge base of the previous culture. 300 years is nothing in historical terms. It's well within the range of oral tradition and direct cultural transmission. Grandparents could have told grandchildren about the world before the flood. Surviving priests or scholars could have taught the next generation what they remembered of mathematics, astronomy, building techniques, and agricultural practices. The break wouldn't have been complete. Fragments would survive, distorted perhaps, but real, and that's exactly what the archaeological record shows at multiple sites across Mesopotamia. After flood disruptions, there's continuity in some aspects of culture while other aspects change. Pottery styles might shift, but temple locations remain sacred. Building techniques evolve, but the principle of temple construction continues. Agricultural practices persist, but political organization restructures. It's the pattern you'd expect from a culture that experienced catastrophic disruption but didn't entirely collapse, that lost some knowledge while preserving other knowledge, that had to rebuild but wasn't starting from absolute zero. The texts themselves become artifacts of this process. When Sumerian scribes in the 3rd millennium BCE copied tablets and explicitly noted they were copying from older, damaged originals, they were participating in the work of cultural reconstruction that had been ongoing for millennia. They were the latest link in a chain of preservation that stretched back through the flood, back to scribes who'd recorded information before the catastrophe because they knew somehow that it might not survive otherwise. The obsessive copying, the multiple versions of the same texts, the careful notation of sources and dates, all of it speaks to a civilization deeply aware that knowledge could be lost, that had perhaps already lost knowledge once and was determined not to let it happen again. One of archaeology's most persistent puzzles is how quickly Sumerian civilization achieved sophistication. Around 3200 BCE, writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, bronze working, and urban planning all appear in southern Mesopotamia not gradually, not experimentally, but already refined. The earliest mathematical tablets demonstrate understanding of complex calculations. The first astronomical texts track celestial movements with precision. The initial examples of writing aren't crude pictograms, but a system already capable of expressing abstract concepts. It's as if someone pressed fast forward on human development, or as if these weren't innovations at all, but memories, pieces of knowledge being reconstructed from fragmentary records of what came before. Think about how innovation normally works. You can trace the development of most technologies through stages of increasing complexity. Pottery begins crude and hand-formed, gradually becoming refined as potters discover better techniques. Architecture starts simple and evolves towards sophistication, as builders learn through trial and error what works and what doesn't. Writing systems begin with basic pictograms and slowly develop the ability to express more abstract concepts. Everywhere we look in human history, we see this pattern of gradual improvement, experimental phases, dead ends that get abandoned, and slow refinement over generations. But Sumerian civilization doesn't follow this pattern. When writing first appears in the archaeological record around 3200 BCE, it's not primitive. The earliest tablets from Uruk aren't just pictograms of grain and sheep. They include numerical signs, abstract concepts, the beginnings of phonetic writing. Within a few centuries, the system can express complex legal concepts, poetry, mythology, and administrative procedures. That's not how writing develops when people are inventing it for the first time. That's how writing looks when people are reconstructing something they remember existed before, but whose details they have to work out again. The same pattern appears in mathematics. The earliest mathematical texts we possess show understanding of multiplication, division, area calculations, and even early forms of algebra. They use the base 60 sexagesimal system with confidence and sophistication, applying it to problems that go beyond simple accounting. There's no experimental phase visible in the archaeological record, no tablets showing mathematicians figuring out basic principles. Instead, we have competent mathematics appearing already formed, as if the principles were known and the task was simply applying them and writing them down. Architecture tells the same story. The temples at Uruk around 3200 BCE demonstrate sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The White Temple sits atop a massive ziggurat platform, its walls precisely aligned to cardinal directions, its structure incorporating drainage systems and load distribution that suggests extensive prior knowledge. The builders weren't figuring this out as they went. They knew what they were doing. They'd either done it before or learned from people who had. Bronze working presents perhaps the most striking example. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and getting the proportions right requires experimentation and accumulated knowledge. You need to know where to find copper ore, how to smelt it, where to source tin, which is relatively rare, and how to combine them in ratios that produce usable metal. Yet bronze artifacts appear in Mesopotamia without the long experimental record we'd expect. The early bronzes show competent metalworking, proper alloy ratios, sophisticated casting techniques. It's as if metallurgical knowledge arrived already developed, perhaps brought by people who'd known it before, perhaps reconstructed from fragmented memory of how it used to be done. Some scholars argue we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages yet, that archaeological sampling is incomplete, and the experimental phases existed but remain buried or unexcavated. That's possible. Mesopotamia is vast and much of it remains unexplored. But we've been excavating systematically for over a century now, and the pattern persists. Where we do find pre-Sumerian occupation, as at Eridu or in the Ubaid period sites, we find competence rather than primitive experimentation. The people living in southern Mesopotamia before Sumerian civilization crystallized weren't bumbling beginners. They were skilled farmers, potters, builders, and artisans who already possessed substantial knowledge. What if the sudden sophistication of Sumerian civilization around 3200 BCE wasn't sudden at all? What if it was a resurgence, a recovery, the flowering of knowledge that had existed before the flood disruptions but had been scattered, fragmented, and was now being systematically rebuilt? The texts themselves hint at this interpretation. They speak of knowledge from before the flood, of wise rulers from the antediluvian period, of learning that had to be recovered and preserved. Perhaps we should take them at their word. Perhaps Sumerian civilization appeared sophisticated because it was drawing on a deeper well of knowledge than we've credited it with, reconstructing sciences and technologies that had existed in the world that came before. In the British Museum, among thousands of cuneiform tablets catalogued and stored in temperature-controlled darkness, sit astronomical text from the early Sumerian period that describe celestial cycles their authors shouldn't have been able to observe. The precession of the equinoxes takes 25,772 years to complete. The Sumerians knew about it. They track the movements of planets with accuracy that required generations of sustained observation. They calculated eclipse cycles, understood the relationship between lunar and solar years, and maintained records of stellar positions that suggested watching the sky wasn't new to them, but something they'd been doing far longer than their supposed emergence from primitive agriculture would allow. The precession of the equinoxes is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, causing the position of stars to shift gradually over millennia. It's barely perceptible within a human lifetime. To detect it, you need sustained observation across multiple generations, careful record keeping, and the mathematical sophistication to analyze the data and recognize the pattern. Yet Sumerian astronomical texts demonstrate awareness of this phenomenon. They tracked which constellations rose on the horizon at particular seasons, noted that these positions shifted over time, and incorporated this knowledge into their calendrical systems and astrological interpretations. How did they know? The standard explanation is that they inherited knowledge from earlier observers, that astronomical observation in Mesopotamia extended back further than we can directly document, and that records were kept and transmitted across generations until patterns became apparent. But that just pushes the question back. Who were these earlier observers? How far back does the tradition extend? If systematic astronomical observation in Mesopotamia goes back far enough to detect precession, we're talking about observational programs lasting thousands of years, which takes us back before Sumerian civilization properly begins, back into the murky pre-flood period that the King List describes. The planetary observations are equally remarkable. The Sumerians tracked Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn with precision that required understanding their complex apparent motions. Planets don't move smoothly across the sky. They speed up, slow down, reverse direction in retrograde loops, all because of the interaction between Earth's orbit and theirs. Working out these patterns requires extensive observation and sophisticated mathematical analysis. Yet the early astronomical texts handle these complexities with confidence, calculating planetary positions, predicting when planets would appear on the horizon, and associating these movements with earthly events in their astrological system. The lunar calendar the Sumerians used required understanding the relationship between lunar months and solar years. 12 lunar months total about 354 days, falling 11 days short of the solar year. If you simply count lunar months, your calendar drifts out of sync with the seasons. The Sumerians solved this by intercalating extra months, adding a 13th month in certain years to keep the calendar aligned with agricultural seasons. This requires mathematical calculation and long-term observation to get right. It's not something you figure out casually. It's the product of systematic study maintained across many generations. Eclipse prediction represents perhaps their greatest astronomical achievement. Eclipses follow complex cycles related to the orbital mechanics of the Earth-Moon-Sun system. The Saros cycle of approximately 18 years and 11 days marks the period after which eclipse patterns repeat. Babylonian astronomers, inheriting Sumerian knowledge, could predict eclipses with impressive accuracy using these cycles. But recognizing the cycles in the first place requires records of eclipses spanning decades or centuries. Someone had to observe, record and analyze these rare events over long enough periods to detect the patterns. What strikes modern astronomers most about these ancient texts is how observational they are. The Mesopotamian astronomers weren't primarily theorists. They were meticulous record keepers who tracked what they saw in the sky night after night, year after year, century after century. The tablets record specific observations. On such and such a date, Venus appeared 3 fingers above the horizon at dawn. Jupiter was near the moon. Saturn reached its stationary point. These are empirical records, the raw data of systematic scientific observation, and they suggest an observational tradition that extended much further back than 3200 BCE, back into periods where we have no direct evidence, but where the king list claims civilized cities existed. The Sumerians themselves seem to understand that their astronomical knowledge was ancient. They attributed its origins to the antediluvian period, claiming that wise kings and priests from before the flood had watched the heavens and passed down their knowledge. Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE but drawing on much older Mesopotamian sources, claimed that astronomical observations in Babylonia extended back over 400,000 years. That's obvious exaggeration or mistranslation, but it preserves the tradition that astronomical knowledge was extremely old, predating the civilization that possessed it. The Sumerian mathematical system used base 60, a choice so sophisticated that we still employ it today to measure time and angles. But more remarkable than the system itself is the mathematics it was used for. Tablets from the early dynastic period show calculations of cube roots, area measurements for irregular shapes, and solutions to algebraic problems that had no practical application in farming or trade. These weren't tools developed for necessity. They were knowledge pursued for its own sake, or perhaps knowledge preserved from a time when such calculations served purposes we no longer understand, serving a civilization we're told never existed. Base 60 seems like an odd choice for a number system. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers, and most human cultures developed decimal systems for that simple reason. But base 60 offers mathematical advantages that only become apparent when doing sophisticated calculations. It's highly divisible, with factors of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes fraction work much easier. You can express 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, and 1/6 all as simple divisions with no remainders. For astronomical calculations involving time and circular measurements, base 60 proves remarkably efficient. But that efficiency suggests the system was chosen deliberately by mathematicians who understood its advantages, not stumbled upon by farmers trying to count sheep. The Sumerians didn't just use base 60 for some calculations while using other systems elsewhere. They committed to it fully, building their entire mathematical framework around it. That's the behavior of people who knew what they were doing, who'd thought through the implications and made an informed choice. It suggests mathematical sophistication from the very beginning of their civilization, as if the system was inherited rather than invented. The mathematical tablets themselves reveal knowledge that goes far beyond basic arithmetic. Plimpton 322, a Babylonian tablet from around 1800 BCE, but drawing on older Sumerian mathematics, contains what appear to be Pythagorean triples over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. It lists sets of numbers that satisfy the relationship where the square of the longest side of a right triangle equals the sum of squares of the other two sides. These aren't random numbers. They're systematically generated, suggesting the mathematicians understood the underlying principles and could calculate new examples. Other tablets show calculation of cube roots, an operation with limited practical use in ancient agriculture or trade. Why would you need cube roots unless you're doing advanced engineering, working with volumes in complex ways, or pursuing mathematics for theoretical purposes? The tablets also demonstrate understanding of what we'd call algebraic thinking, setting up problems with unknown quantities and solving for them using systematic procedures. This is abstract mathematics, the kind pursued by professional mathematicians who have time and resources to explore knowledge beyond immediate practical necessity. Area calculations for irregular shapes appear throughout the mathematical corpus. These go beyond simple rectangles or triangles to handle trapezoids, circles, and complex composite shapes. The methods are sophisticated, sometimes using what amounts to early integral calculus to break complex shapes into simpler components that can be calculated and summed. Again, this is knowledge beyond what subsistence farmers would need. It's the mathematics of architects, engineers, astronomers, people engaged in complex technical projects that required precision and planning. What purpose did this advanced mathematics serve? The standard answer is that it supported administration, architecture, and astronomy. But that just raises more questions. Why did early Sumerian civilization need such sophisticated mathematical tools? What were they building or calculating that required cube roots and algebraic solutions? The complexity of their mathematics suggests they were doing things that have left no archaeological trace, or that we haven't recognized the purpose of structures and artifacts that remain. Perhaps the mathematics itself provides the answer. If Sumerian civilization was reconstructing knowledge from the antediluvian period, then their mathematical sophistication might represent recovered rather than invented knowledge. The texts sometimes claim mathematical procedures come from ancient sources, that they're copying older tablets or preserving traditional methods. What if those traditions extended back before the flood, back to a time when people used this mathematics for purposes we can barely imagine, because the context that made them necessary no longer exists? Sumerian texts repeatedly reference the Abzu, described as the deep waters beneath the earth, the source of wisdom, the place where Enki, god of knowledge, kept his secrets. Modern scholars interpret this as mythology, symbolic representation of groundwater or the cosmic ocean. But archaeological work has revealed something unexpected beneath several Sumerian temples, actual underground chambers, carefully constructed and waterproofed, some with channels bringing in water, others dry but sealed as if protecting something from the elements. Were these the real Abzu, physical libraries where knowledge was stored in the coolness below ground, preserved from the heat that could crack clay and the humidity that could dissolve it? The word Abzu literally means deep water or primordial waters, and in Sumerian cosmology it represented the realm of fresh water beneath the earth, distinct from the salt waters of the sea. Enki, the god of wisdom, crafts and magic, ruled this realm, and from it all knowledge flowed. The texts describe the Abzu as containing the me, the fundamental principles or divine powers that made civilization possible: kingship, priesthood, writing, mathematics, music, craftsmanship, all the arts and sciences that elevated humans beyond animals. To access deep wisdom, one had to descend into the Abzu, literally go down into the depths where Enki kept his secrets. For decades, archaeologists treated this as pure symbolism. The Abzu was a mythological concept, a way of talking about the mysterious sources of fresh water in a desert land, perhaps representing the aquifer that sustained agriculture and life. But excavations at multiple sites began turning up actual underground structures that matched the textual descriptions too closely to be coincidental. At Eridu, Enki's primary cult center, excavators found subterranean chambers beneath the temple complex, some with sophisticated waterproofing, others with channels that brought groundwater into contact with the sacred spaces. These weren't simple wells or cisterns. They were constructed rooms, carefully built with baked brick, sealed with bitumen to prevent water damage, and accessed by stairways descending below ground level. Some contained installations suggesting ritual use, basins, offering tables, spaces clearly designed for priests to perform ceremonies in the cool darkness below, the temple, but others seemed more utilitarian, dry chambers sealed against moisture, their purpose less obvious. Could these have been storage spaces for tablets, for records and knowledge that needed protection from the harsh Iraqi climate? Clay tablets are remarkably durable once baked, but they're vulnerable to moisture and temperature extremes. Repeated wetting and drying can cause them to crack and crumble. Extreme heat can make them brittle. The most effective way to preserve tablets for millennia would be to store them underground in sealed chambers where temperature remained constant and humidity controlled. The Abzu chambers, if that's what they were, would have provided exactly these conditions. Cool, dark, dry, or with carefully controlled water presence, they were ideal archives for preserving knowledge across generations. The texts themselves support this interpretation. Multiple references describe descending into the Abzu to consult ancient knowledge, retrieving wisdom from the depths, bringing up secrets that had been stored below. When Sumerian priests needed to consult old records, to check precedents for rituals, to recover half-forgotten knowledge, the texts describe this as going down to the Abzu, entering Enki's realm, accessing the stored wisdom. That sounds less like mythology and more like an actual practice. Priests descending into underground archives to retrieve and consult old tablets. At Ur, excavators found similar subterranean structures associated with the temple complex. At Uruk, beneath the Iana district, underground chambers suggested use for storage or ritual purposes that brought humans into contact with the symbolic depths. At Nippur, that city of scribes and scholars, the Temple of Enlil had underground components that might have served archival functions. The pattern repeated across multiple sites, suggesting this wasn't a local peculiarity but a widespread practice in Mesopotamian temple architecture. What makes this particularly intriguing is the emphasis Mesopotamian civilization placed on preserving old knowledge. We've found countless tablets that explicitly identify themselves as copies of ancient originals. Scribes would note that they were copying a damaged tablet, that the source was partially illegible, that they were preserving wisdom from earlier periods. This wasn't casual record keeping. This was a civilization obsessed with maintaining connection to its past, with ensuring knowledge didn't get lost again. And what better way to preserve that knowledge than in sealed chambers below ground, in the Abzu, where Enki, god of wisdom, kept everything safe from time and destruction. In Sumerian mythology, Enki is the deity of wisdom, crafts, and fresh water. but the texts describe him less like a divine being and more like a culture hero, a teacher, someone who actively instructed humanity in writing, mathematics, law, and civilization's arts. He's credited with creating the first humans, but in a way that sounds more like genetic engineering than divine magic, mixing clay with blood, creating workers, improving the design through multiple attempts. The stories read like distorted memories of actual events, teachers who brought knowledge, perhaps survivors from the world before the flood who tried to preserve what they knew by passing it to those who came after. The myths about Enki have a different quality than other Mesopotamian divine narratives. When the texts describe Enlil or Anu or Inanna, they emphasize power, majesty, divine authority. These are gods who command and demand worship, but Enki is characterized by cleverness, problem-solving, and active intervention to help humanity. He's the one who warns Ziusudra about the coming flood, instructing him to build a boat and preserve life. He's the one who teaches humans the arts of civilization, how to write, how to calculate, how to build, how to organize society. He's a teacher god, a trickster figure who often operates outside official divine hierarchy to benefit humanity. The creation myths involving Enki are particularly strange. In the Atrahasis epic, humans are created to relieve the gods of labor, to do the work of irrigation and agriculture that the lesser gods were tired of performing. Enki engineers this creation by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, creating a hybrid that has both earthly and divine qualities. The first attempts aren't successful. The humans are flawed, imperfect. Enki refines the design, adjusts the mixture, tries again until the result is satisfactory. This isn't the instantaneous creation of divine will. It's iterative process, trial and error, engineering language describing the development of something complex through successive improvements. Could this myth preserve distorted memory of actual events? Not divine creation, but the emergence of civilization through teaching and knowledge transfer. If survivors from the antediluvian world tried to preserve their knowledge by teaching post-flood populations, those teachers might have become legendary figures over time, their human origins forgotten or deliberately obscured as they were elevated to divine status. Enki the wise teacher becomes Enki the god of wisdom. Enki who taught writing becomes Enki who invented it. Enki who helped humans develop sophisticated culture becomes Enki who created humans in the first place. The texts consistently place Enki in opposition to Enlil, the chief god who often wants to destroy or limit humanity. In the flood narrative, it's Enlil who decides humans are too noisy, too numerous, too troublesome, and decrees their destruction. Enki disagrees and secretly warns Ziusudra, ensuring survival. This pattern repeats throughout the myths. Enlil represents harsh divine justice and limitation, while Enki represents wisdom, preservation, and active help for humanity. Could this reflect actual historical tension between different groups or philosophies in the post-flood period? Perhaps between those who wanted to restrict knowledge and those who wanted to preserve and spread it. Enki's association with the Abzu, with underground spaces of wisdom and water, connects him directly to the preservation of knowledge. He's not a sky god or a storm god or a warrior god. He's associated with depth, with what lies beneath, with the hidden sources of wisdom that must be accessed by descending rather than ascending. That's an unusual divine characteristic in a culture where most gods lived in the heavens or on mountain tops. Enki's realm is below, in the waters beneath the earth, in the underground chambers where secrets are kept safe from destruction. The myth of Enki and Inanna provides another intriguing detail. Inanna, Queen of Heaven, descends to the Abzu to visit Enki, and through trickery steals the Me, the divine powers that encompass all the arts of civilization. She gets Enki drunk at a banquet, and in his intoxication he gives her the Me, which she quickly loads onto her boat and flees back to her city of Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realizes what happened, he sends servants to retrieve the stolen powers, but Inanna escapes with them. The story explains how Uruk became a center of civilization, but it also describes the Me as things that can be physically possessed, loaded onto boats, stolen and transported. That sounds less like abstract divine qualities and more like actual knowledge. Tablets, perhaps, or trained scribes, or technical know-how that could be literally moved from one place to another. What if Enki represents not a god but a tradition? The knowledge keepers, the preservers of antediluvian wisdom, the teachers who worked to ensure that what had been lost in the flood wouldn't be lost forever. Human beings who became mythologized over generations until their human origins were forgotten. But their essential role as bringers of wisdom, teachers of civilization, remained embedded in the stories. The myths describe exactly what you'd expect if survivors from a sophisticated culture tried to pass their knowledge to less developed populations after catastrophic disruption. Teaching, patience, repeated attempts, strategic preservation of the most important knowledge in protected spaces, and tension with those who wanted to control or restrict that knowledge transfer. The Apkallu, or Seven Sages, appear throughout Mesopotamian tradition as beings who emerged from the sea before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. They're described in terms that blur the line between human and divine, depicted in art as composite figures, part human and part fish, as if symbolizing their emergence from water or their nature as survivors of the deluge. The texts name them individually, list what each one taught, and specify that they appeared before the flood swept over. After the catastrophe, they were gone, but what they'd taught remained, fragmentary and half-remembered, this seed from which Sumerian civilization grew. The tradition of the Apkallu extends across millennia of Mesopotamian literature, from early Sumerian texts through Babylonian and Assyrian periods. The Seven Sages appear consistently as culture heroes, teachers who brought knowledge to humanity when it was still primitive and unformed. King lists and religious texts name them. Uana, also called Adapa, was the first and most important, credited with establishing the principles of civilization itself. Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu followed, each associated with specific cities and specific knowledge they imparted. What's remarkable is how the texts describe their appearance. In Assyrian palace reliefs from the 1st millennium BCE, the Apkallu are carved as protective spirits flanking doorways and important rooms. They're shown with human bodies but fish scales, or wearing fish skin cloaks, or with fish heads draped over their human heads like hoods. The imagery is consistent. These beings came from water, emerged from the sea, brought knowledge from somewhere beyond or before the normal world. To ancient artists trying to depict beings who bridged two realms, the fish symbolism made perfect sense. These were people who survived the flood, who came through water, whose origins lay in a world that had drowned. The texts are specific about what each sage taught. Uana brought the principles of kingship, the foundations of urban organization, the arts that separated civilized life from barbarism. Others taught specific crafts, metallurgy, agriculture, building techniques, divination, medicine. The knowledge is practical and technical, the skills necessary to rebuild civilization after catastrophe. This isn't mythology in the sense of explaining cosmic origins or moral lessons. This is cultural memory preserving the names and contributions of actual teachers, individuals or groups who possessed knowledge and passed it on to those who needed to learn. Berossus, that Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the Hellenistic period, provides the most detailed description. He claims the first sage, Oannes, emerged from the Red Sea near Babylon in the early morning. He had the body of a fish with a human head beneath the fish head, and human feet extending below the fish tail. During daylight hours he taught humans letters, sciences, arts, and crafts. He showed them how to build cities, found temples, establish laws, and understand geometry. He explained principles of agriculture and gave them knowledge of everything that tends to civilize life. Then, at sunset, he returned to the sea. This pattern continued, with Oannes and his successor sages visiting during daylight to teach and returning to water at night. The literal interpretation of fishmen living in the sea is obviously problematic. But strip away the mythological overlay and consider what the story might be preserving. Survivors of a flood would have come to land from water, emerging from boats or from higher ground after the waters receded. To people who later heard the stories but hadn't experienced the event, these flood survivors might naturally be described as coming from the sea, as being associated with water, as having somehow lived through or in the deluge. The fish imagery could be metaphorical. These were people who survived when the world drowned, who were at home in water when others perished, who brought knowledge from the drowned world to the new one. The tradition is emphatic that the sages appeared before the flood and that their direct presence ended with the catastrophe. After the waters receded, there were no more Apkallu teaching humanity directly. But their knowledge remained, passed down through human teachers who'd learned from them, preserved in the skills and techniques they'd taught, fragmentarily remembered in texts that tried to record what they'd said. It's exactly the pattern you'd expect if actual pre-flood teachers had worked to preserve knowledge, successfully transmitting enough that civilization could rebuild, but not surviving themselves, or not remaining as a visible presence in the post-flood world. Mesopotamian kings routinely claimed descent from or connection to the Apkallu. To legitimize rule, to demonstrate possession of wisdom, to establish continuity with the deep past, rulers would trace their lineage or knowledge back to these ancient teachers. Inscriptions describe kings consulting the wisdom of the Apkallu, following their principles, rebuilding temples according to their original plans. This wasn't empty propaganda. This was a civilization that genuinely believed its foundational knowledge came from these ancient sources, that what they knew about building, governing, calculating, and organizing society had been taught by the sages from before the flood. Modern archaeological excavation has confirmed that Shuruppak, the last city listed in the king list before the flood, was a real place. The ruins lie beneath the modern site of Tel Farah in Iraq. When excavated in the early 1900s, it revealed something remarkable: evidence of massive flooding around 2900 BCE, followed by temporary abandonment and then resettlement. The city's last king, according to the king list, was Uba-Tutu, whose son Ziusudra was the Sumerian Noah, the survivor who preserved civilization's knowledge through the catastrophe. And in Shurupak's tablets, among records of barley and silver, appear some of the oldest known literary texts, proverbs, wisdom literature, as if the city's scribes knew they were recording knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The excavations at Tel Farah began in 1902 led by Robert Calderway, and later by German and American teams who returned intermittently throughout the early 20th century. They uncovered a substantial city with multiple building levels, temples, administrative complexes, and dense residential areas. The site revealed a prosperous urban centre engaged in agriculture, trade, and craft production. But what caught the excavators' attention was the stratigraphy. The layers of occupation interrupted by a thick deposit of water-laid clay and silt. The flood deposit at Shurupak was unmistakable. It stretched across the excavation area, sterile of artifacts clearly laid down by water, rather than accumulated through human occupation. Dating techniques available at the time placed it around 2900 to 2800 BCE, roughly contemporary with the early dynastic period when Sumerian civilization was consolidating into the form we recognize. Above the flood layer, occupation resumed with slightly different pottery styles and building techniques, suggesting either new inhabitants or survivors who'd returned after abandonment and were rebuilding with altered practices. What made Shurupak particularly significant was its direct connection to the flood narrative. This wasn't just any ancient city with evidence of flooding. This was the specific city the Sumerian texts named as the last antediluvian capital, the place from which Ziusudra, the flood hero, supposedly came. The king list stated that Ubatutu ruled Shurupak before the flood, and that his son survived to preserve civilization. Finding flood evidence at exactly this location validated the textual tradition in a way that sent ripples through both archaeology and biblical studies. The flood story had a real location, a real stratum of destruction, and correspondence with the specific chronological period. The tablets recovered from Shurupak added another layer of intrigue. Among the thousands of economic and administrative texts recording barley loans, silver weights, and temple inventories were literary works that stood among the oldest known. The Instructions of Shurupak, a wisdom text where a father advises his son, was found in multiple copies. These proverbs and moral teachings represented some of humanity's earliest preserved literature, practical wisdom about how to live, how to conduct business, how to avoid trouble, and how to maintain relationships. The text presents itself as the advice of Shurupak, a sage or king, to his son Ziusudra. The significance of finding this text at this location cannot be overstated. Here was a real city, flooded around the time the text described, producing literature that named the characters from the flood narrative. Shurupak the sage advising Ziusudra, his son, wasn't pure invention. These were names associated with a real place where people really lived, where scribes really worked, where knowledge was really being recorded and preserved. The Instructions of Shurupak reads like exactly what it claims to be, a father's wisdom passed to a son who would need it to survive what was coming. Were the scribes of Shurupak aware they lived in a flood-prone region? Did they know catastrophe was possible, perhaps even likely? The care they took in recording wisdom literature, the multiple copies of the instructions, the preservation of proverbs and practical knowledge alongside economic records, suggests a culture that valued the transmission of information across generations. Whether they specifically anticipated the flood that would strike their city, or simply understood in general terms that knowledge could be lost, and therefore must be carefully preserved, they acted like people who knew that what they recorded might be all that survived them. After the flood at Shurupak, occupation resumed, but the city never regained its former prominence. The resettlement was smaller, less wealthy, less influential in the larger Sumerian political world. It was as if something vital had been lost in the catastrophe, some concentration of knowledge or population or resources that couldn't be fully replaced. The city continued for centuries but in diminished form, gradually declining until it was finally abandoned around 1800 BCE. But its tablets survived, buried in the ruins, preserving both the mundane and the meaningful, the economic records and the wisdom literature, everything that would allow future archaeologists to reconstruct not just that the city existed, but what its inhabitants thought was worth preserving. When George Smith announced in 1872 that he'd discovered a Babylonian account of the flood among tablets from Nineveh's library, the world reacted with shock. Here was a story older than Genesis describing the same catastrophe in remarkable detail. But the Epic of Gilgamesh contains more than flood narrative. It describes Gilgamesh's quest to visit Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, who lives beyond the world's edge and guards ancient knowledge. The hero's journey takes him through landscapes that sound less like mythology and more like distant memory, a tunnel through mountains, a garden of precious stones, a ferryman who crosses waters that bring death to touch. What if these aren't poetic inventions, but geographical features that once existed, preserved in story when the land itself changed beyond recognition? George Smith was working at the British Museum, cataloguing and translating the massive collection of cuneiform tablets that had been excavated from the Assyrian capital of Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd-Rassam decades earlier. These tablets came from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, who'd systematically collected texts from across his empire to create what may have been the ancient world's greatest library. Among thousands of tablets covering everything from omens to medical texts, Smith found fragments of an epic poem about a hero named Gilgamesh, who searched for immortality. As Smith pieced together the broken tablets, a narrative emerged that seemed hauntingly familiar. There was a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. One man was warned and built a boat, saving his family and animals. The boat grounded on a mountain. Birds were sent out to test whether the waters had receded. When the flood subsided, the survivor made offerings to the gods. The parallels to the biblical Noah story were unmistakable, but this Mesopotamian version was demonstrably older, carved on tablets that predated the oldest Hebrew scriptures by centuries or millennia. The implications were profound and controversial. Either the biblical account borrowed from Mesopotamian tradition, or both preserved memory of the same actual event. But the flood story is only one tablet of 12 that comprise the Epic of Gilgamesh. The larger narrative describes Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, who after the death of his friend Enkidu becomes obsessed with discovering the secret of eternal life. He learns that Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, achieved immortality and lives somewhere beyond the known world. Gilgamesh undertakes a perilous journey to find him, travelling through lands that read like half-remembered geography of a world that no longer exists in recognizable form. The journey takes Gilgamesh to the twin mountains of Mashu, which support the sky. Between them lies a tunnel of darkness through which the sun passes each night. Gilgamesh travels through this tunnel, walking in complete darkness for 12 leagues, until he emerges into a garden of precious stones, where trees bear fruit made of gems and carnelian. He meets Siduri, a divine tavern keeper who lives beside a sea, and she directs him to Urshanabi, the ferryman who can cross the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim's dwelling place beyond. These details are oddly specific for pure fantasy. Twin mountains flanking a dark passage sound like a description of a mountain pass or canyon that early travellers might have used as a route. A garden of precious stones could be metaphorical, or could describe a region rich in minerals and gems that seemed fantastical to lowland Mesopotamians, unfamiliar with mountain geology. The sea Gilgamesh must cross to reach Utnapishtim is described as containing waters of death that destroy anyone who touches them, which might preserve memory of a dangerous water crossing, perhaps the Persian Gulf with its strong currents and unpredictable weather, or even the Red Sea. What makes the geography particularly intriguing is that Utnapishtim lives beyond the normal world, in a place where flood survivors might plausibly have relocated. If sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, drowning coastal regions, then survivors might have moved to higher ground or more distant locations. From the perspective of people who later repopulated the drowned lands, these survivors would indeed be living beyond, in marginal regions that seemed like the edge of the world. The journey to reach them would involve crossing dangerous waters and traversing unfamiliar landscapes that later became legendary as the geographical knowledge faded. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, the flood survivor tells him the story of the deluge and reveals that he achieved immortality only through that unique circumstance, that the gods granted it specifically because he survived the catastrophe. He cannot give Gilgamesh eternal life, but he tells him of a plant growing at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, but then loses it to a serpent while bathing on his return journey. He arrives back in Uruk empty-handed, having learned that immortality is beyond human reach, but also having connected with the deepest past of his civilization, having heard directly from someone who remembered the world before the flood. The epic treats Utnapishtim as a historical figure, not a deity. He's human, though granted divine favour. He possesses knowledge of the antediluvian world. He guards the memory of what was lost. This framing suggests the Babylonians who copied and preserved this epic understood it as containing genuine historical tradition, however much it had been embellished with poetic and mythological elements. Gilgamesh was a real king whose reign is attested in multiple sources. His quest to meet the flood survivor might preserve memory of actual attempts by post-flood civilizations to connect with survivors, to learn from them, to recover knowledge that had been lost in the catastrophe. The vast reigns of the antediluvian kings have troubled scholars since the king list was first translated. 28,000 years for a single ruler seems absurd. But what if we're misunderstanding the system of measurement? Some researchers have suggested the numbers represent months rather than years, reducing Alulim's reign to a more manageable 2,400 years. Still too long, but closer to comprehensibility. Others propose the figures are symbolic, representing qualities rather than quantities. But a third possibility exists. What if the numbers are accurate, but they're measuring something that isn't individual human lifespans? What if they're recording dynasties, or cultural periods, or astronomical cycles that the ancients considered reigns of cosmic forces rather than earthly kings? The problem of the long lifespans has generated more scholarly ink than perhaps any other aspect of the Sumerian king list. Modern sensibilities reject the possibility of individual humans living tens of thousands of years. Biology doesn't support it. No culture has ever documented such longevity. The numbers must mean something else, must be symbolic or mistranslated or measuring different units than we assume. Yet the text itself provides no indication that these numbers should be interpreted as anything other than straightforward time measurements. The scribes recorded them with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for everything else. The lunar month theory has appeal because ancient Mesopotamians used both lunar and solar calendars, and confusion between them could theoretically explain inflated numbers if the Antediluvian years were actually lunar months of roughly 29.5 days. Then you divide the vast figures by 12 to get solar years. Alulim's 28,800 years becomes 2,400 years. Alulgar's 36,000 becomes 3,000. These are still impossibly long for individual humans, but become plausible for dynasties or cultural periods. The problem is that the Sumerians were sophisticated mathematicians who understood the difference between lunar months and solar years. They regularly intercalated months to keep their calendar aligned with seasons. It seems unlikely they'd confuse the two when recording their own history. The symbolic interpretation suggests the numbers represent qualities rather than quantities. Perhaps they indicate importance, sacredness, or cosmic significance rather than actual duration. A king listed as ruling 28,000 years might be one of supreme importance, while a king listed at 10,000 years would be less significant. This approach treats the numbers as a ranking system encoded in temporal terms. But if that were the case, why do the reigns gradually decrease from the earliest to the latest antediluvian kings? Why does the pattern show reduction over time rather than ranking by importance? And why would the list switch to plausible numbers after the flood if the numbers were never meant to be temporal measures in the first place? The third interpretation, that the numbers are essentially accurate but not measuring human lifespans, opens more intriguing possibilities. What if Alulim wasn't a person but a period, an epoch, an age of cultural development or astronomical cycle that lasted 28,800 years? The name would then represent not an individual but an era, perhaps named for whoever ruled or was most significant during that period, but understood by later scribes as a vast stretch of time rather than a single lifetime. This interpretation allows the numbers to be accurate while avoiding the biological impossibility of extreme human longevity. Ancient Mesopotamians thought cyclically about time. They tracked astronomical cycles, recognized that celestial movements repeated over vast periods, and organized their cosmology around these repetitions. The precession of the equinoxes takes approximately 25,800 years. The reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings total 241,200 years, which is roughly 9 1/3 precession cycles. Could these numbers be encoding astronomical knowledge, measuring cosmic ages rather than human lives? Could the antediluvian period represent the time span across which civilization watched the sky, tracked the stars, recorded observations that accumulated into the sophisticated astronomical knowledge the Sumerians demonstrably possessed? Another possibility is that the numbers preserve chronology from a different, older, calendar system that we no longer understand how to decode. The sexagesimal base 60 system the Sumerians used creates mathematical relationships that seem strange to decimal thinking. If they were recording time in a base 60 framework with units we're unfamiliar with, the numbers might be accurate within that system, but appear absurd when we try to translate them into our temporal framework. Without knowing what unit they were actually measuring, we're left guessing at how to interpret the figures. Perhaps most intriguing is the pattern the numbers follow. They're not random. They're not round figures. They show structure and variation that suggests real data of some kind is being recorded. After the flood, the reigns decrease systematically over multiple dynasties until they reach human-scale lifespans. It's as if the list is documenting a real process of change. Whether that's changing measurement systems, declining lifespans in mythology, the fading of a golden age, or the gradual shift from recording cosmic ages to recording human history. Something is being measured that changes predictably over time, and the king list faithfully records that change even though we've lost the framework to interpret it correctly. The Sumerian king list isn't unique in describing impossibly long reigns before a great flood. The Egyptian priest Manetho recorded 30 dynasties of human pharaohs preceded by dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled for thousands of years. Hindu texts describe yugas, vast ages spanning hundreds of thousands of years before our current era. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the 3rd century BCE, listed 10 antediluvian kings with reigns totaling 432,000 years. These traditions developed independently, separated by geography and culture, yet they share a common structure. Normal human history preceded by an age of long-lived rulers, ended by catastrophic flood. When different cultures remember the same pattern, perhaps we're not dealing with myth, but with fragmented memory of something that actually occurred. Manetho compiled his history of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE for the Ptolemaic court. He had access to temple archives and priestly records extending back millennia, sources that have since been lost. According to his chronology, which survives only in quotations by later writers, Egyptian history before the human pharaohs included a period when gods ruled Egypt, followed by a period when demigods or spirits of the dead ruled, and then a transitional dynasty before mortal kings took power. The divine and demigod periods covered tens of thousands of years. Modern Egyptologists dismiss these early sections as mythology, focusing on the human dynasties that can be corroborated with archaeological evidence. But the structure is strikingly similar to the Sumerian king list, vast ages of divine or semi-divine rulers preceding normal human history. The Hindu Puranas describe time in even vaster scales. A Mahayuga consists of 4 ages or yugas totaling 4,320,000 years. 1,000 Mahayugas comprise a kalpa or day of Brahma. Multiple kalpas have passed since creation. We currently live in the Kali Yuga, the final age of the current cycle, characterized by decline and corruption. The previous ages were longer and characterized by greater human lifespans, more direct divine interaction, and higher levels of knowledge and power. This cosmic chronology dwarfs the Mesopotamian figures, but the pattern is identical. Present human history is diminished compared to vast previous ages when beings lived longer and possessed greater capabilities. Berossus, writing his Babyloniaca in Greek during the same period Manetho compiled his Egyptian history, drew on Babylonian temple records to present Mesopotamian history to Hellenistic readers. His account of the antediluvian period lists 10 kings ruling for 432,000 years before the flood. The numbers differ from the Sumerian king list, which gives 8 kings and 241,200 years, but both preserve the same basic tradition of very long reigns before catastrophe. Berossus also described Owans and the other Apkallu in detail, providing the fishmen imagery and teaching traditions that supplement the earlier Sumerian sources. His work survives only in fragments quoted by later Greek and Christian writers, but those fragments demonstrate that the Mesopotamian tradition of antediluvian civilization was still being actively maintained in the Hellenistic period, centuries after cuneiform writing had begun to fade. What's remarkable about these parallel traditions is their independence. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Hindu civilizations developed separately. They didn't borrow these chronological frameworks from each other. Each created its own version organically from its own sources, yet all arrived at similar structures: vast previous ages of long-lived or divine rulers, followed by catastrophe, followed by diminished present-day humanity. This parallel development suggests they might all be preserving fragmented memory of actual historical patterns, however distorted by time and cultural interpretation. Flood stories themselves appear in cultures worldwide. Greek tradition remembers Deucalion's flood. The Bible records Noah's flood. Hindu tradition includes multiple flood narratives. Native American traditions across both continents contain flood stories. Pacific Island cultures remember times when the sea rose. These stories vary in details but share core elements. Catastrophic flooding destroys most of humanity. A few survivors preserve themselves through foreknowledge or divine favor. After the waters recede, life begins again. Geologists now know that global sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 BCE, drowning coastal regions worldwide. Humans living in those coastal areas would have experienced this as catastrophic, gradual inundation over centuries or sudden when ice dams broke and released massive floods. Cultural memory of these events could easily be preserved through oral tradition, becoming the flood stories that appear in nearly every culture. If we accept that the floods in these traditions preserve memory of real events, then perhaps the pre-flood chronologies also preserve something real, however distorted. Not literal individual humans living tens of thousands of years, but something about the timescale of pre-flood civilization, the ages across which it developed, the vast time span it existed before catastrophe disrupted it. The traditions might be telling us that civilization is older than we think, that sophisticated cultures existed before the flood events that ended the Ice Age, and that those cultures maintained records and knowledge across time frames we've been unwilling to consider, because they don't fit our model of gradual human development from primitive origins. The convergence of these traditions from multiple independent cultures creates what researchers call consilience, the strengthening of claims when multiple independent lines of evidence point in the same direction. One culture remembering vast pre-flood ages might be dismissed as mythology. Three major civilizations independently preserving the same pattern becomes harder to explain away. Either there's something about human psychology that makes cultures naturally invent this specific narrative structure, or these traditions are preserving distorted but real memory of actual historical patterns that preceded recorded history as we currently define it. Academic archaeology has a complex relationship with the Sumerian king list. Scholars acknowledge its historical value for the post-flood period, using it to establish chronology for the early dynastic kings whose reigns seem plausible and whose palaces we've excavated. But when discussion turns to the antediluvian section, the academic papers become cautious, dismissive, or simply silent. The long-lived kings are mythology, we're told. The pre-flood cities are legendary. The flood itself, if it happened at all, was a local event exaggerated in cultural memory. Yet the physical evidence keeps complicating that narrative. The flood deposits woolly found at Ur, the 18 successive building levels below flood layers at Eridu, the sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization with no apparent gradual development to explain it. This selective acceptance of ancient sources creates an uncomfortable tension in the field. When the king list says Gilgamesh ruled Uruk, archaeology confirms this and accepts the text as historical. When it lists the dynasties of Ur and Lagash and Kish, scholars use these sequences to establish chronological frameworks for the 3rd millennium BCE. The text is treated as reliable historical documentation for everything that fits comfortably within established timelines. But the moment the same document describes pre-flood kings with impossibly long reigns, It transforms in academic treatment from history to mythology, from useful source to embarrassing primitive belief that must be explained away rather than explained. The reasoning is understandable. Science operates on principles of parsimony and empiricism. Claims that contradict known biological limits require extraordinary evidence. Individual humans don't live 28,000 years. Cities haven't been found that date to the periods the antediluvian chronology would require. The flood deposits discovered at various Mesopotamian sites are localized, not evidence of a global catastrophe. Given these facts, the simplest explanation is that the pre-flood section of the King List is mythological, an origin story, a theological framework that ancient scribes themselves might not have considered literal history. But this dismissal ignores troubling details that don't fit the mythology interpretation. The precision of the records, the specific city names that archaeology has confirmed as real places, the consistent pattern across multiple independent textual traditions, the flood deposits that do exist at multiple sites even if not globally, and most importantly, the sudden appearance of sophisticated Sumerian civilization without visible developmental stages all suggest something more complex is happening. The texts might not be literally accurate in every detail, but they might be preserving distorted memory of real events, real chronologies, and real civilizations that existed before the flood disruptions. Consider how archaeology has repeatedly vindicated ancient texts that were initially dismissed as legendary. Troy was considered mythological until Heinrich Schliemann excavated it in the 1870s. The Hittites were thought to be biblical invention until their empire's remains were discovered in the late 19th century. Linear B was assumed to be decorative marks until Michael Ventris proved it was an actual writing system recording Greek. The existence of King David was disputed until the Tel Dan Stele confirmed him as a historical figure. Again and again, archaeology has discovered that texts dismissed as myth or legend contained kernels of genuine historical memory, however embellished or distorted by transmission across centuries. The antediluvian section of the King List might be another case where future discoveries will prove the texts were preserving something real, however much we currently struggle to interpret them correctly. The settlements beneath the flood layers at Eridu that predate Sumerian civilization proper, the sophisticated astronomy and mathematics that appear already formed without developmental phases, the parallel traditions in Egypt and India and Mesopotamia, all independently remembering vast previous ages ended by catastrophe, these aren't comfortable facts for a model of history that assumes civilization gradually developed from primitive origins around 6,000 years ago, and that nothing significant preceded that emergence. What mainstream archaeology often ignores is not the physical evidence, which it documents meticulously, but the implications of that evidence when taken collectively rather than site by site. Yes, flood deposits at one site might be local, but flood deposits at multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia, occurring around similar time periods, separating occupation layers that show cultural discontinuity, that's a pattern suggesting something more significant happened. Yes, the sophisticated mathematics and astronomy of early Sumeria might have developed quickly. But when that development shows no experimental phases, no visible learning curve, and appears already refined, perhaps we should consider whether it was being reconstructed from earlier knowledge rather than invented for the first time. The academic reluctance to engage seriously with the antediluvian traditions isn't necessarily dogmatism or closed-mindedness. It's the reasonable caution of a discipline that's been burned before by spectacular claims that couldn't be substantiated. Von Däniken's Ancient Astronauts, Atlantis theories placing advanced civilizations in impossible locations and times, claims of electricity in ancient Egypt or aviation in ancient India, all of this pseudo-archaeology has made serious scholars understandably wary of anything that sounds like alternative history. The result, though, is sometimes an overcorrection where anomalous evidence gets minimized or ignored rather than investigated, and ancient texts get dismissed when they describe things outside the accepted framework rather than prompting reconsideration of that framework. Scattered through Sumerian texts are references to climate and landscape that don't match modern Iraq. They describe abundant water, lush marshlands, a world significantly wetter and more temperate than the region became. Geological studies confirm that the Persian Gulf was much lower, before rising sea levels flooded the region around 5000 BCE. What's now desert and arid plain was once river delta and marsh, exactly as the ancient texts describe. Could the antediluvian cities have existed in this drowned landscape, their true remains now beneath the Gulf's waters? Could the flood have been not a single deluge, but the gradual inundation of the region, as Ice Age glaciers melted and seas rose, drowning the cradle of civilization and forcing its survivors to relocate and rebuild? The Mesopotamia we can excavate today is radically different from the Mesopotamia of the early Holocene. Modern Iraq is arid, with agriculture dependent on irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates. Summers are brutally hot. Water is precious. The landscape is dominated by desert and scrubland with narrow bands of fertility along the rivers. But this hasn't always been the case. Climate studies and geological surveys reveal that the region was substantially wetter during the early Holocene, roughly 12,000 to 5,000 years ago. Rainfall was higher. The rivers carried more water. Marshlands extended across southern Iraq, where now there's only dry land. The Persian Gulf was smaller, its northern shoreline significantly south of where it is today. Sea level rise at the end of the last ice age transformed coastal regions worldwide. As massive ice sheets covering North America and Eurasia melted, billions of tons of water that had been locked in glacial ice flowed into the oceans, raising sea levels by approximately 120 meters between 15,000 and 7,000 BCE. This wasn't a sudden flood, but a gradual rise punctuated by periods of rapid increase when ice dams failed or ice sheets collapsed. The overall effect took millennia, but individual events within that time frame could be catastrophic and devastating to coastal populations. In the Persian Gulf region, sea level rise would have progressively inundated the northern shoreline, drowning what had been coastal plains and river deltas. Current seafloor surveys have mapped ancient river channels extending across what is now the Gulf floor, channels that would have been dry land when sea levels were lower. These channels suggest that during the Ice Age, the Tigris and Euphrates flowed much further south than their current confluence, crossing what's now underwater, before emptying into a much smaller gulf. The landscape would have been a vast river delta, ideal territory for early human settlement, with abundant fresh water, fertile soil, and rich marshland ecology supporting dense populations. If antediluvian cities existed in this region, their remains would now be underwater, buried beneath Gulf sediments, archaeologically inaccessible without underwater excavation in difficult conditions. This would explain why we haven't found direct evidence of them. We've been looking in the wrong place. The cities that survived and continued, like Eridu, would have been those situated inland at higher elevations, while coastal settlements were abandoned as seas rose and their inhabitants were forced to relocate northward. The survivors moving inland would have been climate refugees in modern terminology, fleeing gradual inundation that destroyed their homeland and forced them to rebuild in less ideal locations. The Sumerian texts themselves support this interpretation. They consistently describe the land before the flood as more abundant, more fertile, more blessed than what came after. They speak of cities by the sea that no longer exist. They reference regions that can't be identified on current maps because the geography has changed. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions geographic features that don't match the Mesopotamia we know, suggesting either poetic invention or memory of landscapes that were real when the stories originated but have since been transformed by climate and sea level changes. The pace of sea level rise varied significantly across the post-glacial period. Most of the rise was gradual enough that populations could adapt, moving incrementally as waters advanced. But there were pulses of rapid rise associated with catastrophic meltwater events. Around 8200 BCE, the final collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet in North America released massive quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, raising global sea levels potentially several meters within a brief period. Around 5500 BCE, geological evidence suggests another significant pulse, possibly associated with the flooding of the Black Sea when Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus. These rapid events would have seemed like catastrophic floods to populations experiencing them, sudden disasters that drowned familiar landscapes and forced mass migration. If we place the Sumerian flood traditions in this geological context, they make more sense. The flood that swept over wasn't necessarily a single event, but a process of ongoing inundation across millennia, punctuated by catastrophic pulses that became the dramatic center of the cultural memory. The antediluvian cities existed in the coastal regions that are now underwater. The survivors fled inland, establishing new cities like Eridu and Duruk on higher ground. They preserved what knowledge they could, but much was lost in the displacement. The world they remembered was literally drowned, its remains buried beneath the Persian Gulf, accessible only through the fragmentary texts they managed to preserve and copy and pass down through generations. In 1994, when excavations began at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists expected to find another Neolithic village, modest and crude. Instead, they uncovered massive stone temples with pillars weighing up to 16 tons, decorated with sophisticated carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The radiocarbon dates came back, 9600 BCE, perhaps older. This was monumental architecture from the Stone Age, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture, hadn't developed urban living, hadn't acquired the social organization necessary for such projects. Yet there it stood, older than Sumeria, older than Egypt, proof that civilization's emergence was far more complex than our textbooks claimed. If Göbekli Tepe could exist 8,000 years before Sumeria, what else might have existed that we simply haven't found? The site sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a landscape of rolling hills and rocky outcrops that seems unremarkable until you start digging. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led the excavations from 1995 until his death in 2014, initially thought he was excavating a Byzantine cemetery. Then the team reached the megaliths, massive T-shaped limestone pillars standing in circular arrangements, and everything they thought they knew about the Neolithic period had to be reconsidered. This wasn't supposed to exist. Not here, not at this time, not built by people who were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers just beginning to experiment with agriculture. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe range from 3 to 6 meters tall and weigh up to 16 tons. They're not natural stones. but carefully shaped and carved, transported from quarries up to 500 meters away, and erected in precise geometric arrangements. The circles of pillars, called enclosures, were then deliberately buried, and new enclosures built beside or on top of them, creating a sequence of construction and ritual abandonment that spanned over 1,000 years. At least 20 enclosures have been identified through geophysical surveys, though only a small percentage of the site has been excavated. What's been uncovered so far suggests Göbekli Tepe was a regional ritual centre, a place where dispersed communities gathered for ceremonies, feasting, and construction projects that required coordinated labour from hundreds of people. The decorative carvings on the pillars demonstrate artistic sophistication that shouldn't exist in the 10th millennium BCE. There are three-dimensional sculptures of foxes, boars, gazelles, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and other animals, all rendered with anatomical accuracy and dynamic energy. There are abstract symbols whose meanings remain obscure, H-shapes, circles, crescents, geometric patterns that might represent astronomical observations or symbolic communications. Some pillars show human arms and hands in low relief, suggesting the stones were meant to represent stylized human figures, anthropomorphic beings watching over the ritual spaces. The whole complex speaks of symbolic thought, religious belief, and artistic expression at a level that forces us to reconsider what humans were capable of during the Neolithic period. What makes Göbekli Tepe particularly significant for our understanding of civilization's origins is its date. At 9600 BCE, it predates pottery, predates permanent settlements, predates everything we associate with the Neolithic Revolution. The people who built it were supposedly pre-agricultural, still living as mobile hunter-gatherers, yet they marshalled the labour, developed the techniques, and maintained the social organisation necessary to quarry, transport, and erect these massive stones. They created a ritual centre that drew people from across the region. They possessed sophisticated beliefs that required complex symbolic expression in stone. This isn't the behaviour of primitives. This is the behaviour of people with culture, organisation, and knowledge. The implications ripple through archaeology. If monumental architecture existed at Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BCE, what else existed that we haven't found? The site sat unknown beneath a hill for 11,000 years until someone decided to excavate there. How many other tells and mounds across the Near East contain similar surprises? How many sites remain undiscovered or unexcavated because they don't fit the expected timeline and therefore don't attract investigation? The discovery fundamentally challenges the narrative that civilization emerged suddenly in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE and Egypt around 3100 BCE. Something more complex was happening across a much longer time frame. Göbekli Tepe also demonstrates that sophisticated social organization preceded agriculture rather than following it. The standard model held that agriculture led to settled life, which led to surplus production, which freed people for specialized tasks, which eventually produced civilization. But at Göbekli Tepe, the monumental architecture comes first. The social organization necessary to build it existed before permanent settlements. This suggests that religious or cultural motivations might have driven early civilizational development, that people organized themselves for ritual and symbolic purposes before they organized for economic ones. The drive to create sacred spaces, to gather for ceremony, to express beliefs in permanent form might have been what pushed humans toward the innovations we associate with civilization. And if Göbekli Tepe existed in 9600 BCE, fully 5,000 years before Sumerian civilization emerged, what happened during those 5 millennia? Was there continuous development that we simply haven't documented? Were there rises and falls of cultures that left minimal archaeological signatures? Did knowledge accumulate, get lost in catastrophes like the flooding events at the end of the Ice Age, and then get slowly reconstructed by survivors? Göbekli Tepe proves that humans were capable of sophisticated achievements far earlier than we thought. It makes the Sumerian king list claims about antediluvian civilization seem less impossible and more like potential descriptions of cultural developments we haven't fully mapped yet. Look closely at the archaeological record and technological anomalies appear. The precision drilling of stone vases in pre-dynastic Egypt, the transport of 100-ton stones at Baalbek, the acoustic engineering at temples throughout Mesopotamia, where specific chambers amplify certain frequencies while dampening others, the metallurgy at sites where bronze artifacts appear before we believe bronze working was invented. None of this proves ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology beyond our understanding, but it does suggest they knew more than we give them credit for, that techniques and knowledge existed which were somehow lost, perhaps in the very catastrophes the ancient texts keep describing, floods and disasters that broke the chain of knowledge and forced survivors to begin again with fragments. The stone vases from pre-dynastic Egypt, dating to around 3500 to 3100 BCE, demonstrate precision that is difficult to explain with the tools we believe were available. These aren't crude bowls. They're elegant vessels carved from hard stones like diorite, granite, and basalt, with walls sometimes less than a millimeter thick, perfectly balanced, with internal curves that required removing stone from areas that couldn't be directly accessed. Modern attempts to reproduce these vases using copper tools and sand abrasives struggle to match the precision of the originals. The ancient craftsmen achieved smoothness and symmetry that suggests either techniques we don't understand or tools more sophisticated than copper chisels. At Baalbek in modern Lebanon, the Roman temple complex sits atop a platform containing some of the largest worked stones in the world. The trilithon consists of 3 limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons. These aren't Roman work, but earlier construction that the Romans built upon, dating to uncertain but ancient periods. A 4th stone, called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, still lies in the quarry nearby, weighing approximately 1,000 tons. How were these moved? The Romans, master engineers who built roads and aqueducts across their empire, didn't move stones this large. Their largest constructions used stones of perhaps 50 to 100 tons. 800-ton blocks are in a different category entirely, requiring technologies or techniques that left no trace in the archaeological record. Acoustic engineering appears at multiple ancient sites in ways that seem too sophisticated to be accidental. At the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, certain chambers resonate at a frequency around 110 Hz when sounds are made within them. Modern acoustic analysis shows this frequency can affect human brain activity, potentially inducing altered states of consciousness. At the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, hand claps in front of the pyramid produce echoes that sound like the chirp of the Quetzal bird, sacred to the Maya. At various Mesopotamian temples, archaeologists have documented chambers where specific architectural features amplify certain sound frequencies while dampening others, as if the spaces were designed for acoustic effects. Were these intentional? Did ancient builders understand acoustic principles well enough to engineer spaces for specific sound qualities? Bronze working presents chronological anomalies at several sites. Bronze requires combining copper and tin in proper proportions, and tin sources are relatively rare. The technology supposedly developed gradually across the late 4th millennium BCE in the Near East. Yet bronze artifacts appear at sites like Ban Chiang in Thailand dated to around 3500 BCE, contemporary with or even preceding Near Eastern bronze. Serbian sites have produced copper tools from the 5th millennium BCE, much earlier than copper working was supposed to exist in that region. Either our chronologies for metallurgical development are wrong, or knowledge of metalworking spread much earlier and wider than we've documented, or multiple independent centers developed these technologies in parallel. These anomalies don't require assuming ancient aliens or lost super-civilizations with electricity and computers, but they do suggest our understanding of ancient capabilities is incomplete. Techniques existed that we've either lost or never properly understood. Knowledge of materials, methods, and engineering that ancient craftsmen possessed through long tradition might have been far more sophisticated than we credit. When civilizations collapsed or experienced the catastrophes described in ancient texts, much of this practical knowledge would have been lost with the master craftsmen who held it. Later generations would have to rediscover techniques through trial and error, sometimes successfully, sometimes settling for cruder methods that were good enough, even if inferior to what their ancestors achieved. The pattern of technological loss and recovery appears throughout history. The Romans made concrete that has lasted 2,000 years and still surpasses modern concrete in certain qualities. The formula was lost for over a millennium after Rome fell. Medieval Europeans couldn't match the steel quality of Roman weapons. The Damascus steel techniques were lost when the crucible steel centers declined. Greek fire, the Byzantine incendiary weapon, remains mysterious because the formula was so closely guarded it was lost when the empire fell. If we lose specific knowledge within recorded history despite having writing, libraries, and continuous civilization, how much more would be lost after catastrophic floods that destroyed cities, displaced populations, and disrupted the transmission of knowledge for generations? When you examine the surviving clay tablets from early Sumeria, certain patterns emerge. Beyond economic records and temple inventories, the scribes devoted enormous effort to preserving specific types of knowledge. Astronomical observations, mathematical tables, chronological lists, technical procedures for metallurgy and building, medical texts, and above all, copies of older texts. The tablets often specify their copies, that the original was ancient, damaged, barely readable. Scribes were frantically copying deteriorating records, racing against time and decay to preserve knowledge they clearly valued as irreplaceable. It's the behavior of people who know they're the inheritors of something precious and fragmentary, not the originators of something new. Walk through the British Museum's collection of cuneiform tablets, or the University of Pennsylvania Museum's holdings from Nippur, or Yale's Babylonian collection, and you'll see this pattern repeated across thousands of texts. Many tablets include colophons, endnotes added by scribes identifying themselves and describing the circumstances of the copy. They write things like, "Copy of an ancient tablet, the original damaged and illegible in places," or "Written from a worm-eaten tablet, text unclear," or "Copied from an old tablet from before the flood," claiming explicitly that their source predated the catastrophe. These aren't casual notations. These are careful documentation by scribes who understood they were part of a preservation project spanning generations. The types of knowledge receiving this careful copying treatment reveal what Mesopotamian civilization considered most valuable and most at risk of loss. Astronomical texts were copied extensively, with multiple versions of the same observations preserved in different archives. Mathematical tables were reproduced across centuries, with scribes adding corrections or alternative methods while preserving the original procedures. Medical texts were maintained with careful notation of which treatments came from ancient sources versus contemporary practice. Technical manuals describing metallurgy, glass-making, and building techniques were preserved, even when some of the procedures they described were no longer fully understood or practiced. This last point is particularly telling. Some tablets describe processes that the copying scribes apparently didn't fully comprehend. They preserved the text faithfully because they valued it as ancient knowledge, even though the practical application has been lost. It's like someone today copying a medieval manuscript on sword making, who's never actually forged a sword, preserving the text not because they can use it, but because they recognize it as valuable knowledge that shouldn't be allowed to disappear. The Mesopotamian scribes were doing the same thing, maintaining texts whose full meaning or application they might not grasp, but whose importance they recognized. The king lists themselves exemplify this preservation impulse. Multiple copies exist from different cities and different periods, each one carefully maintained and updated. The scribes who copied the antediluvian sections knew the numbers seemed strange, knew the pre-flood kings were from a different type of time, but they preserved those sections anyway because the texts were ancient and important. They didn't rationalize the numbers or edit them to make more sense. They copied what they found, adding notations when sources disagreed but maintaining the integrity of the original data. This is the behavior of archivists and librarians, not of people inventing mythology. Nippur, that city of scribes mentioned earlier, functioned essentially as Mesopotamia's central library and scribal academy. Apprentice scribes learned their craft there by copying standard texts, including mathematical problems, literary works, and historical records. The pedagogy involved exact reproduction, training young scribes to copy faithfully without introducing errors. This created generations of professionals who valued textual accuracy, who understood their role as maintainers of civilization's knowledge rather than creators. The tablets they produced weren't literature in our modern sense of creative works. They were documentation, preservation, the careful maintenance of knowledge that had to be protected against the decay of clay, the destruction of libraries in wars, and the simple passage of time that could erase what wasn't continually recopied. The scribal colophons sometimes express urgency, written quickly before the tablet crumbles, or copied in haste as the original was breaking. You can sense anxiety in these notes, awareness that knowledge was fragile, that originals deteriorated, that without constant effort to copy and preserve, everything could be lost again. These weren't people confident in their civilization's permanence. These were people who'd inherited fragments, who knew their ancestors had lost much, and who were determined to preserve what remained. The Sumerian scribes wrote as if they knew catastrophe was possible, as if they'd seen or heard of times when knowledge was nearly lost, and they weren't going to let it happen on their watch. Of all the ancient Sumerian cities, Nippur held special status. It wasn't the wealthiest or most powerful. It produced no dynasty of kings. Yet it was considered the spiritual center of Mesopotamia, this city where kingship was legitimate only if blessed by Nippur's god Enlil. More importantly, Nippur's scribal schools preserved the largest collection of literary and scholarly texts, thousands of tablets containing everything from mathematical problems to wisdom literature, hymns to administrative records. When excavations began in the 1880s, they found library after library, schools where scribes learned not just to write, but to copy and preserve the oldest texts. Nippur was civilization's memory, the place where the past was kept alive, where records too important to lose were duplicated and stored against the day when they might again be needed. The University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur, beginning in 1889, lasted intermittently for decades and recovered over 30,000 cuneiform tablets. This wasn't the personal library of a king or the archive of a single temple. This was an institutional collection, multiple libraries and scribal schools accumulated across centuries, representing Mesopotamia's deliberate effort to maintain its knowledge base. The tablets covered every conceivable subject: religious hymns and mythology, mathematical exercises and astronomical tables, medical diagnosis and herbal remedies, legal precedents and administrative procedures, literary works and wisdom literature. If it was knowledge worth preserving, Nippur had copies. What distinguished Nippur from other cities was its political neutrality. While Uruk, Lagash and Kish competed for supremacy, fought wars, and rose and fell in cycles of conquest and defeat, Nippur remained apart from these struggles. It held no political ambitions. Its importance was purely religious and scholarly. Kings who conquered other cities left Nippur intact, even supported it, because to destroy Nippur would be to destroy Mesopotamian civilization's collective memory. The city functioned as neutral ground where scribes from different city-states could come to study, where copies of important texts were deposited for safekeeping, where the accumulated wisdom of the region was maintained regardless of which dynasty currently held power. The scribal schools at Nippur followed rigorous training programs. Students learned cuneiform by copying standard text repeatedly until they'd internalized both the writing system and the content. They progressed through levels of difficulty, starting with simple word lists and moving to complex literary works, mathematical problems, and specialized technical texts. The pedagogy emphasized exact replication. A properly trained scribe could reproduce a text character by character without introducing errors, a skill essential for preserving knowledge accurately across generations. The schools produced professionals who understood their role not as creative artists but as faithful maintainers of tradition. Archaeological work at Nippur revealed the physical structure of this preservation system. The excavators found houses of tablet collections, rooms stacked floor to ceiling with clay texts organized by subject matter. They found school buildings where student exercises lay scattered alongside master texts. They found temple libraries where official copies of religious and administrative documents were kept. The entire city was organized around the production, storage, and preservation of written knowledge. It was Mesopotamia's Library of Alexandria, except it predated Alexandria by 2 millennia and survived much longer, functioning continuously from the 3rd millennium BCE into the Parthian period around the 1st century CE. The tablets themselves often reveal the preservation networks that connected Nippur to other cities. Colophons mention texts being sent from distant libraries for copying, scholars travelling from other cities to consult Nippur's collections, and copies being made to send back to provincial centres. Nippur was the hub of a knowledge distribution system spanning all of Mesopotamia. When a provincial temple needed an authoritative version of a ritual text, they sent to Nippur. When a king wanted to establish legitimacy by demonstrating knowledge of ancient precedents, scribes consulted Nippur's archives. The city was civilization's backup drive, the place where everything important was copied and stored against catastrophe. And the scribes of Nippur seem to have been acutely aware of catastrophe's possibility. their careful documentation of source texts, their notation of damage to originals, their maintenance of multiple copies of the same works, all suggest people who knew knowledge was fragile. They'd inherited traditions about the flood, about times when knowledge was nearly lost, about the importance of preservation. They weren't going to be the generation that let the past disappear. Their obsessive copying, their institutional dedication to maintaining texts even when the practical use wasn't immediately apparent, their creation of a city whose entire purpose was memory, all of this speaks to a civilization that understood what was at stake. Plato's account of Atlantis has been dismissed as allegory or complete invention for thousands of years. Yet he insists it's true history, told to Solon by Egyptian priests who claimed their records extended back 9,000 years before his time. They described a catastrophe that destroyed an advanced civilization, leaving only fragments and survivors. The dates Plato gives roughly align with the end of the last ice age, when rising sea levels drowned coastal regions worldwide. The Egyptians told Solon his people had forgotten this history because repeated catastrophes had destroyed Greek records and forced them to begin again, as if from nothing. What if Plato wasn't inventing? What if he was preserving a tradition that paralleled what the Sumerian tablets record? Memory of a world before, lost to flood and time. The story appears in two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias, written around 360 BCE. Plato frames it carefully as an account passed through multiple generations. Egyptian priests told it to Solon, the Athenian lawmaker, around 600 BCE. Solon told it to his relative Dropides. Dropides told it to his son Critias the Elder, that Critias told it to his grandson Critias the Younger. And Critias the Younger, appearing as a character in Plato's dialogue, relates it to Socrates. This chain of transmission is specific enough to be checked, which was unusual for ancient philosophical writing. Plato wasn't presenting this as abstract allegory. He was claiming it was actual history preserved through oral tradition. The Egyptian priests, according to the account, told Solon that Greek civilization was young and amnesiac. The Greeks had forgotten their own past because periodic catastrophes destroyed their records and killed their literate classes, forcing survivors to rebuild from near nothing. The priests claimed Egypt's records extended back 9,000 years and remembered events the Greeks had lost. One such event was the war between Athens and Atlantis, fought approximately 9,600 years before Solon's visit, which would place it around 9600 BCE. That date should sound familiar. It's roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, with the end of the Younger Dryas period, with the catastrophic climate changes that mark the transition from Ice Age to interglacial conditions. Atlantis, according to Plato's account, was an island nation beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we identify as the Strait of Gibraltar. It possessed advanced civilization with sophisticated architecture, engineering and political organization. The Atlanteans had conquered much of the Mediterranean world but were defeated by Athens. Then came catastrophe. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the sea, disappearing completely. The account emphasizes the suddenness and totality of the destruction, leaving no trace except the story preserved in Egyptian records. Scholars have spent 2 millennia attempting to locate or explain Atlantis. Most academic analysis treats it as Plato's allegory about the dangers of imperial hubris, a cautionary tale dressed in pseudo-historical garb to make philosophical points about ideal societies and their corruption. The geographic and chronological details are seen as literary decoration, not meant to be taken literally. Yet Plato himself insists multiple times that the story is true, not fiction. He, as Critias, say, "The fact that it is not a fiction but genuine history is of great importance." That's an unusually explicit claim for what everyone assumes is allegory. What if we take Plato at his word? Not necessarily accepting every detail as literally accurate, but considering that he was preserving a tradition that contained genuine historical memory, however distorted by transmission across 6,000 years. The pattern matches what we see in Mesopotamian traditions: a catastrophic flood or flooding event at the end of the Ice Age, an advanced civilization destroyed, survivors preserving fragmentary knowledge, records maintained by one culture, Egypt, that other cultures, Greece, had lost. The chronology placing the catastrophe around 9600 BCE, contemporary with known climate disasters and the Younger Dryas impact. The Egyptian priest's explanation for why Greeks had forgotten is particularly interesting. They describe a cycle of catastrophe and rebuilding, where literate civilization gets destroyed periodically, forcing survivors to restart with reduced knowledge. Each cycle loses more of the past until eventually the catastrophes themselves become mythological rather than historical memory. This matches the pattern the Sumerian texts suggest: antediluvian civilization with vast knowledge, catastrophic flood, survivors struggling to preserve and reconstruct what was lost, eventual emergence of historical civilization like Sumeria that retains fragments but has forgotten the full context. Atlantis might not have been a specific island that sank in a day. It might have been the collective term for coastal civilizations that were progressively drowned as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The single day and night of destruction might preserve memory of particularly catastrophic flood pulses when ice dams failed or tsunamis struck, events that would have seemed like instantaneous destruction to those experiencing them. The advanced civilization might refer not to a single nation but to the general sophistication of pre-flood cultures that had developed during the Ice Age in regions that are now underwater. Plato's account, like the Sumerian king list, might be preserving real historical memory in a form that seems impossible only because we're interpreting it too literally. In recent decades, geological evidence has emerged for a massive catastrophe around 10,800 BCE. The Younger Dryas period saw temperatures plummet globally, ice sheets surge, and massive flooding as glaciers collapsed. Evidence suggests multiple asteroid or comet impacts on ice sheets, causing rapid melting and worldwide flood events. The date places it several thousand years before Sumerian civilization emerged, but perfectly timed for the world the king list might be remembering, the antediluvian civilization that was swept away and survived only in fragments. Could the stories of the flood preserve accurate memory of this real catastrophe? Could the impossibly long lifespans represent the thousands of years between the impact and the rebuilding that eventually became Sumeria? The Younger Dryas was a period of dramatic climate reversal, lasting from approximately 10,800 BCE to 9,600 BCE. After millennia of gradual warming following the last glacial maximum, temperatures suddenly plummeted back to near Ice Age conditions. Ice sheets that had been retreating expanded again. Forests died and were replaced by tundra. Sea levels that had been rising stabilized or even dropped slightly. Then, equally abruptly, the cold period ended around 9600 BCE. Temperatures shot up again, ice sheets collapsed rapidly, and massive flooding occurred worldwide as the meltwater surged into the oceans. For decades, scientists debated what caused this climate whiplash. The leading theory involved disruption of ocean currents by massive freshwater influx from melting ice sheets, but that explanation couldn't account for all the evidence. Then researchers began finding high concentrations of rare elements and nanodiamonds in sediment layers dating to the Younger Dryas boundary. These markers suggested extraterrestrial impact, possibly a fragmenting comet striking ice sheets and triggering the climate reversal. Subsequent research has identified impact markers at multiple sites across North America and Europe, suggesting not a single impact but multiple fragments from a disintegrating comet striking across a wide area. The effects of such impacts on ice sheets would have been catastrophic. The kinetic energy would have melted massive quantities of ice instantly, sending huge volumes of meltwater into the oceans and atmosphere. The impacts would have lofted debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid cooling. Wildfires ignited by the impacts would have burned across continents, evidenced by widespread charcoal and soot layers in the geological record. Coastal regions would have experienced tsunamis and sudden flooding. Any civilization existing at that time would have faced an apocalyptic scenario: fires, floods, climate collapse, and social chaos. The chronology is significant. The Younger Dryas impacts occurred around 10,800 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was constructed around 9600 BCE, shortly after the Younger Dryas ended. The earliest layers of occupation at Eridu begin around 5500 BCE. The Sumerian king list describes 8 antediluvian kings ruling for 241,200 years, which, if interpreted as some kind of astronomical or calendrical cycle, rather than individual reigns, could represent the period from the Younger Dryas through the gradual recovery and eventual emergence of Sumerian civilization. The texts would thus be preserving memory of the time between catastrophe and rebuilding, the long dark age when survivors struggled to preserve knowledge and slowly reconstruct civilization. Evidence for the catastrophe keeps accumulating. The sediment layers show it. The climate data confirm it. The extinction of numerous megafauna species at the Younger Dryas boundary suggests environmental catastrophe beyond normal climate variation. North American mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other species disappeared at precisely this time. The human population in North America seems to have crashed, with Clovis culture ending abruptly and being replaced by different, apparently smaller populations using different technologies. Something devastating happened that affected the entire Northern Hemisphere and possibly beyond. If human civilizations existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and evidence like Göbekli Tepe suggests some level of sophisticated culture did exist, then those civilizations would have been destroyed or severely disrupted by the impacts and subsequent climate chaos. Survivors would have faced a hostile world, temperatures in flux, food sources destroyed, social structures collapsed, populations decimated. The knowledge they carried would have been fragmentary, whatever they could remember, and passed down through oral tradition while struggling just to survive. It would take thousands of years for populations to recover, for climate to stabilize, for conditions to allow the rebuilding that eventually produced Sumerian civilization. The flood stories in Mesopotamian tradition would preserve memory of this real event, distorted by transmission across 10,000 years, but still recognizably describing an actual catastrophe that drowned the world their ancestors knew. If we accept that some form of advanced society existed before the flood events that ended the last ice age, we must consider how anything survived. The answer appears in the texts themselves. The stories repeatedly mention those who were warned, who prepared, who preserved. Ziusudra in the Sumerian account, Utnapishtim in the epic of Gilgamesh, Noah in the Hebrew Bible. All are described not just as good men saved by divine favour, but as bearers of knowledge, people who took the wisdom of the previous world with them into the next. The boat isn't just a lifeboat, it's an ark in the original sense, a container, a vessel for preserving what matters most. When the waters receded, survivors carried with them fragmented knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, building, agriculture, all the pieces of civilization that would take centuries to fully reconstruct. The flood narratives across different cultures share this theme of preparation and preservation. Someone is warned in advance. They're given time to prepare. They build a boat large enough not just for their family, but for representatives of all living things, for supplies, for everything necessary to restart after catastrophe. The emphasis is consistently on preservation, on carrying the old world into the new, on ensuring continuity despite disruption. These aren't stories about lucky escapes. These are stories about deliberate salvage operations, about people who understood catastrophe was coming and took steps to preserve what mattered. In the Sumerian account, Enki warns Ziusudra and instructs him to build a boat. The text specifies that Ziusudra should pay attention to divine words, listen to the message being conveyed, and act on the warning. The boat, when completed, saves not just Ziusudra but the seed of humanity, the animals, the potential for life to continue. After the flood subsides and the boat grounds, Ziusudra makes offerings and is granted eternal life by the gods, becoming effectively immortal and living beyond the normal world as a keeper of ancient knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh has Utnapishtim tell essentially the same story, but with more detail, describing the boat's construction, the loading of treasures and craftsmen, and the post-flood world where survivors must rebuild. These saved craftsmen are significant. Utnapishtim doesn't just save random people. He specifically takes aboard craftsmen and their families, people who possess specialized knowledge and skills. He loads treasures, which likely means not just gold and silver, but also tablets, tools, seeds, everything necessary to maintain civilization's knowledge base and restart productive work after the catastrophe. The boat isn't just preserving biological life, it's preserving cultural knowledge, technological capability, the accumulated wisdom of civilization. It's a mobile archive, a lifeboat for knowledge as much as for people. The Hebrew Bible's account of Noah has similar emphasis. Noah is instructed to take his family, pairs of all animals, and supplies sufficient for an extended voyage. He's also described as righteous and blameless, chosen specifically because he maintains proper knowledge and behavior that should be preserved. After the flood, Noah's descendants repopulate the earth, but they've lost much of the antediluvian world's knowledge. The Tower of Babel story that follows suggests post-flood humanity tried to rebuild but was scattered and confused, losing the unity and shared knowledge they'd briefly reconstructed. The narratives consistently describe a pattern of catastrophe, partial preservation, difficult rebuilding, and diminished outcomes compared to what existed before. Archaeological evidence supports the possibility of survivors preserving and transmitting knowledge. Göbekli Tepe's construction around 9600 BCE, shortly after the Younger Dryas catastrophe, demonstrates that sophisticated knowledge survived somewhere, somehow. Someone knew how to quarry and transport 16-ton stones. Someone possessed the organizational skills to coordinate large labor forces. Someone maintained religious or cultural traditions that valued monumental expression enough to commit enormous resources to it. This knowledge didn't appear from nowhere. It survived the catastrophe, carried by refugees or survivors who knew what had been lost and were determined to preserve and rebuild what they could. The emphasis in flood narratives on being warned and preparing suggests cultural memory of people who did exactly this, saw catastrophe coming, whether through astronomical observation, climate awareness, or other means, and took deliberate steps to survive and preserve knowledge. The boat becomes symbolic of any refuge where knowledge keepers rode out the disaster. High ground, caves, isolated regions beyond the worst flooding, anywhere that allowed small populations to survive with their knowledge intact. When conditions stabilized, these survivors emerged and began teaching, transmitting what they knew to larger populations, seeding the recovery that eventually produced historical civilizations like Sumeria. If the Sumerian records contain truth rather than myth, the implications reshape everything we think we know about human civilization. History doesn't begin with Sumeria. It resumes there. Something came before, something sophisticated enough to develop mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and writing. Something that was destroyed or disrupted so severely that its survivors could preserve only fragments. The cities we excavate aren't humanity's first attempt at civilization, but perhaps its second or third or 100th. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement, slowly climbing from primitive origins. We're the latest iteration of a cycle that may have repeated before. Civilizations rising, reaching toward knowledge, then falling to catastrophe natural or self-inflicted, leaving only enough fragments for the next generation to slowly, painfully rebuild, wondering why the ruins beneath their feet seem so much more magnificent than anything they can create themselves. This perspective inverts our usual view of history. Instead of progressive ascent from primitive to sophisticated, we see cycles of rise and fall. Instead of assuming we know more than our ancestors, we might consider that we've forgotten more than we remember. The ancient obsession with preserving knowledge, the extensive copying programs at places like Nippur, the careful notation of sources and dates, all make more sense if understood as responses to previous loss, attempts to prevent another dark age where knowledge disappears and has to be painfully rediscovered. The implications touch everything. Our chronology of civilization becomes uncertain if Göbekli Tepe demonstrates sophisticated culture in 9600 BCE, and if the Younger Dryas catastrophe around 10,800 BCE suggests something existed before that was destroyed, then how far back does civilization really extend? Are there older sites still undiscovered or underwater, drowned by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age? The Persian Gulf floor, the Mediterranean coastlines, the North Sea doggerland that connected Britain to Europe, all were dry land during the Ice Age and are now submerged. If civilization developed in those regions, we're looking in the wrong places for its remains. Our understanding of human capabilities requires reconsideration. The Younger Dryas survivors who built Göbekli Tepe weren't primitive. They possessed knowledge, organization, and traditions sophisticated enough to create monumental architecture. Where did they learn these skills? Not in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, but before it, in the world that was destroyed. They were carrying forward knowledge from the antediluvian period, however fragmentary. If they could do that, then that earlier civilization must have been even more sophisticated than Göbekli Tepe suggests. And if Sumerian civilization emerged with fully formed mathematics, astronomy, and writing, Perhaps it was continuing this process of recovery, reaching back toward knowledge levels that had existed before the flood and been partially lost. The cycle itself becomes a framework for understanding not just ancient history, but the human condition. Civilizations are fragile. Knowledge can be lost. Catastrophes, whether natural like the Younger Dryas impacts or self-inflicted like nuclear war or climate change, can destroy centuries of accumulated wisdom in brief periods. The survivors face the enormous task of preserving what they can and rebuilding with fragments. This pattern might have repeated multiple times across human history, each iteration struggling to recover knowledge the previous cycle possessed, each generation wondering why the ancients seem to know more than seems possible, given their supposed primitive state. The Sumerian scribes understood this. Their obsessive copying, their notation that text came from before the flood, their maintenance of records they didn't fully understand, all indicate awareness that knowledge was previously lost and must be guarded carefully to prevent loss again. They were civilization's memory keepers, standing between the catastrophe that nearly ended everything and the potential future catastrophe that might end it again. They succeeded. We have their tablets. We can read their warnings. The question is whether we're listening to what they were trying to tell us, that civilization isn't guaranteed, that knowledge can disappear, that what seems permanent can drown beneath waters, or burn beneath fires, or collapse beneath the weight of catastrophe we couldn't imagine until it happened. And perhaps that's the deepest meaning of the Sumerian king list, of the flood stories, of all the ancient traditions describing vast ages before catastrophe. They're not just recording what happened, they're warning what could happen again. They're reminding us that we're not the first to reach for knowledge, not the first to build cities and track stars and attempt to understand the cosmos. Others came before. Others achieved sophistication we're only now beginning to credit them with. And others survived catastrophe that destroyed most of what they'd built, preserving just enough to seed the next attempt. We're their descendants, their latest iteration, standing on foundations they laid and trying to rebuild what they lost. The tablets aren't asking us to believe in impossibly long-lived kings. They're asking us to remember that civilization is precious, knowledge fragile, and the work of preservation eternal. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider those ancient scribes in Nippur pressing their stylus into wet clay by lamplight. They were copying texts they might not have fully understood, preserving numbers that seemed impossible, maintaining records of a world before the flood that most people dismissed as legend even then. But they copied faithfully anyway, because they knew something we're only beginning to remember, that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems permanent can vanish beneath waters or time, leaving only fragments for those who come after. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding mysteries we're only beginning to unravel. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, patient as stone, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. They weren't primitive. They weren't inventing myths to explain what they couldn't comprehend. They were remembering, preserving, warning. They were standing at the edge of the abyss their civilization had barely survived, looking back at what was lost and recording everything they could so that we, their distant descendants, might one day piece together what really happened in the world before the flood swept over. Tonight, under the same stars the Sumerian astronomers tracked with such intensity, under the same moon that marked their calendars and guided their mathematics, you're connected to them across 5,000 years of unbroken human wonder. The Questions they asked are the questions we still ask. The knowledge they fought to preserve is knowledge we're still trying to recover. The catastrophes they survived are catastrophes we might face again. But like Zusudra loading his boat with craftsmen and treasures, like the scribes of Nippur copying their crumbling tablets, like all the knowledge keepers across human history who understood that memory matters and preservation is sacred, we carry forward what we've been given. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient watchers knew, under the wheeling constellations they mapped so carefully, into the deep waters of sleep where time dissolves and all the ages of human striving blend together into one continuous story. Rest now. The tablets will still be there when you wake, patient and mysterious, holding their secrets in baked clay, waiting for the next generation to ask the right questions, to see the patterns, to remember what was forgotten. The ancient world isn't gone. It's sleeping beneath our feet, beneath the waters, beneath the sand, dreaming of the day when someone will finally understand what it was trying to preserve. Let that mystery carry you gently down into peaceful darkness, where the past and present meet, where the flood survivors and the tablet keepers and all of us who wonder about our origins become one continuous thread of human consciousness stretching back and back and back into the mists before history began. Sleep well. The ancient world is still here, whispering